Hey you! I'm so glad you're here today. I'm Jenny Prochko from Al's Indigo, and I make videos about spirituality, goal setting, journaling, mental health and awareness, and my story. Today I'm sharing with you this gorgeous paint with me that is one of my favorites so far. This is the Night Rider Lily paint with me. So grab your watercolors or bullet journal or your watercolor papers, and let's get into this beginner lily paint with me tutorial. First, I wanted to show you the overall shape of this Night Rider lily. It's a almond shape, and what I'm doing is I'm pulling the paint, the extra pigment and color back up towards the middle of the flower, because that's where the flower is the darkest. So I'm outlining the petals that I have drawn in here, and then just dragging that extra water and pigment where I want the darkest parts of the flower to be. So that's what I'm doing first. I'm just filling in the petals and dragging that extra color towards the center where I want the flower to be the darkest. I'm also alternating the petals that I do. That way each petal has a little bit more time to dry and the water doesn't bleed into the next petal. Remember, just drag that extra pigment back towards the center. Now I'm working on a petal that is beneath these top three ones, and I'm adding a little bit more pigment to create a darker, richer color underneath that petal that's just above it, and to give it a little bit of shading. And I'm doing the same all around, creating a bit more shading and darkness towards the center. And I've taken the same color today and just watered it out or used it in a more concentrated version, which you can see here in the middle. I dabbed a bunch of really dark pigmented strokes in the middle, and then I got my paintbrush really wet and started to drag those dark colors out onto the further points of the petal. And then if I went too far, I just drag them right back in towards the center, just pushing that darkness where I want it to go. This is a really loose watercolor painting. It's not meant to be very defined and rigid. So if you feel a little bummed out or disappointed with your painting or with your technique, don't be. This is supposed to be very, very forgiving and very flowy. Now I'm working on the underside of this petal that has curled under. I'm adding a little bit more darkness and pigment to the bottom parts of the petals where I want it to look like there's more shading and less light. And here is an overview of what the flower looks like at this point. And now I'm moving on to one of the upper buds. I have three flowers here. I've got a completely open bloom, one that is starting to open that I'm working on right now, and then I have a closed bud as well. For the bloom that is starting to open, I'm working on the petals that are in the back first. And I'm going to let that dry for a little bit while I work on the flower bud that is completely closed. And you can see I'm starting with my pigment the darkest at the very top of this flower bud. and then I'm just pushing that dark pigment where I want it to go, and I want the lightness to be on the underside of this bud that hasn't completely opened yet. Now I'm moving back over to the flower that has started to open a little bit and creating some more definition so we can see the different petals as they start to open. After you finish this video, make sure you head over to owlsandindigo.com and sign up for the private monthly spirituality journaling prompt that goes out on the 1st of every month. You'll receive a private email from me, the secret monthly spirituality journaling prompt, a private video explanation, and a peek into my private journal entry for the same spirituality question for the month. Sign up now before the 1st. The link is in the description. And now I'm just going back in and creating a little bit more shading where I want it, since the first biggest flower that is the most open has dried a little bit. I don't like to let my watercolor paintings dry completely. I like to work with them while they're still wet. So I like to use a lot of pigment first and then thin it out with water as I go on the page. I'm also not using special paper here. I'm just using the paper that is in my bullet journal. And it works really well. I don't have any bleeding issues or any ghosting on the other side of the pages with my watercolors. There, I'm just pulling that dark pigment where I want it to go. I want it to be darker on the underside of this petal that is curled under. So I'm just dragging and pushing that pigment in the direction I want it to go. And it will dry darker in those sections as well because I've placed the pigment there. And now I'm moving on to creating the stems and leaves. I'm using 4 colors today. To get the purple, I used a mixture of purple, black, and a red that isn't a bright red. It's more like a sienna or like a brick red to get that deep, dark purple shade that I used for the flowers. And then the 4th color is just a green that I am thinning out or saturating depending on the level of pigmentation that I want in my watercolor painting in my bullet journal. And here is our first little leaf. I love making leaves. It's one of my favorite things to do in watercolor paintings, especially the botanical ones. I have a lightly saturated pigment here. I have it very, very loose and very watery as well. And I'm trying to keep these 2 leaves separate in the pigmentation and depth and richness of that watercolor that I've just laid down. I'm going to let that dry for a little bit while I work on the stems. And while those leaves dry a little bit more, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the inner part of my lily, the stamen of the flower. This is the anther and the filament portions of the flowers. This is the part that has the pollen on it. And now I'm moving on to the stigma, which is the little triangular spoke in the middle of the flower. And to create those lines, I'm using an orange from my Winsor Newton Pocket watercolor palette, or I'll leave it linked down below if you're curious. I really like this palette. It's got a lot of color options, and the watercolor cakes dry completely. The other color that I was using for this painting comes out of a tube and it is always wet. So I really enjoy taking the pocket one with me if I'm going outside and painting out in the wild. And now that my leaves have dried a little bit, I'm adding a bit more depth and shade and shadow to the underside of these leaves as if they have curled up a little bit. And then I'm adding in just a smidge more color to give the leaf a 3D effect and make it less flat. And remember, just pull that color in the direction that you want it to go. Pull that color wherever you want the painting to be the darkest, and just drag it out of the areas that you want to be lighter. And then just work with the colors until you have the shading where you want it. You can see here I am picking up the page a little bit so I can help the water just move and fall into the place where I want it on the page. Next, I am moving on to my monthly bullet journal portion of this spread. If you are interested in how I set up my bullet journal every month, check out the link up above and down below so you can see my monthly plan with me that features this beautiful, beautiful Night Rider lily. These stamps are super awesome. I actually created them myself. I have a video on that as well, which I will leave linked up above and down below, so you can make your own DIY moon phase stamps for your journal as well. If you created this Night Rider lily painting, make sure you tag me on Instagram so I can see your recreations. I love to see them. I'm so grateful that you chose to spend your time here with me today. I really, really enjoy creating these watercolor paint with me's, and I love that I'm doing it in my bullet journal. I don't have to have any like special canvases or any other special tools other than a paintbrush and a little bit of watercolor. So I hope that you recreate this. If you do, make sure you tag me at @AllisonIndigo over on Instagram so I can see your recreations. I love seeing them and I love chatting with you. Next month we're gonna have another paint with me for October, and it is going to be special. So keep an eye out for that too. And don't forget to sign up for the private monthly spirituality prompt that goes out on the 1st of every month. The link is in the description. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.